Well, welcome everybody to what I'm happy to say is becoming a regular occurrence here to another brewer series here in Google, New York. So cheers to that, right? Today I have the pleasure of introducing Rob Tod, who is the owner-operator of Allagash Brewery up in Portland, Maine. Allagash started first beer sold in 1995. And I've been going strong ever since. So just to let you know kind of where this stemmed from, some of you probably remember when Sam Calagione was here from Dogfish Head a few months ago, back in March. About 2 months after that, I got added to the string of emails because Rob did a talk at was San Francisco, correct? The Google San Francisco office, and emailed Sam and said, "Hey, I did a talk at Google. You really should give it a shot. It's great." And Sam responded back with something like, "Hey, I beat you to it. I did one about a week ago." But my absolute favorite part of that whole interaction was the email that shows up in my inbox. Imagine this for all you brew beer lovers out there. I get an email in my inbox. Subject line is "Yo." It's forwarded to me. It's from Rob Tod to Sam Calagione, and the first line of the email subject line "Yo" is "What up, bitch?" I love my job. So without further ado, Rob Tod.
Great, thanks a lot. Good, you can hear me. First of all, sorry, my voice is a little hoarse. I did a couple events yesterday and finished the night at the Blind Tiger. And I was there. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been there, but it's very loud. And I was screaming at the top of my lungs basically for 4 hours straight. So it was a good time. And then I ended up standing on a chair and yelling to everyone. And at that point, basically my voice was gone. So it's actually coming back a little now, which is good. But yeah, so I did talk out at the San Francisco headquarters, which was a lot of fun. The way this whole thing started, I was in February out at San Francisco Beer Week doing an event in Oakland. And Dave Cohen and Dustin Diaz, who work out at the San Francisco branch, were at an event I was at. And I had just switched over from another email over to Gmail. And at first it took me a little getting used to, but after a while I just fell in love with Gmail. I was like, this is like the coolest thing on the planet. It saved me so much time. I love the way it worked. I'm just like a huge believer. And I was like all excited about this Gmail. And these guys from the Gmail team were at this event, and they came up to me and they're like, "Oh, we love Allagash beer. We're on the Gmail team at Google." I was like, "No way. I love what you guys do." And we talked for a while, and then they said, you know, "Would you be interested in coming out to talk about beer at the Google campus?" I was like, "Absolutely. Just tell me when you want me there, and I'd love to do it." So that's how I ended up out there. We had a great time out there. And then, yeah, like Adam said, I was so excited about it. I told Sam, and I guess Sam had already spoken here. So, but I'm not sure if he's been out there yet. But so I didn't have like a super firm talk planned. I just figured I'd talk a little bit about the brewery and the beer, talk a little bit about each of these beers we're trying today, and then do a little slideshow as we talk. But anyway, brief history of Allagash. I started the company back in the summer of 1994. Spent about a year basically just building the brewery, cobbling it together with a lot of dairy equipment. We were extremely small. It was a 15-barrel system. Like I said, with dairy equipment, not very sophisticated. Then I ran it alone for the first year, brewing all the beer, washing the kegs, loading the trucks, unloading the trucks, and continuing to build the brewery. Our first year's production was 120 barrels, which is equivalent to 240 kegs. And that made us one of the smallest breweries in the country. There were definitely some smaller breweries, but it's tiny production. Just to kind of put that in perspective, you know, we were 120 barrels. Sierra Nevada at the time was probably around 500,000 barrels, or in that range. And Anheuser-Busch is about 100 million barrels a year. So we're extremely small. We started just doing exclusively Belgian-style beer. Our first beer was the Allagash White, which is what I'm drinking now. And it's now become our flagship. It's over 80% of our production. Since then, we've added a lot of beers, and we have a pretty cool selection of them here today. And we're not volume-driven at all. And in fact, over the first 10 years, we grew really, really slowly. We grew from about 120 barrels to 2,000 barrels, probably over the first 10 or 12 years. And the last 3 or 4 years, we've grown a lot more quickly, from around 2,000 barrels to 15 or 16,000 barrels a year production. We have 20 employees. I know that's not quite as fast as you guys have grown, from probably in the same amount of time, from 2 employees to 20,000 employees. But we're not volume driven, but the Belgian category and kind of experimental beer category, which you'll taste some of our more experimental beers, which still fall into Belgian beer category. But that category has just taken off lately. There's been a huge amount of interest. When I started, I used to walk into accounts, even really for the first 10 years, and I'd pour people a sample of the Allagash White, and the first thing bartenders would look at, they'd be like, why is it cloudy? And they'd taste it, and they'd be like, why does it look weird? Why does it taste weird? What's wrong with this beer? People had really never had these Belgian-style beers, never really had unfiltered beers. And so it was a real kind of long, slow educational process. But they've taken off lately. So this first beer, the Allagash White, probably most of you have gotten a chance to try it. Like I said, it's the one we sell the most of. It's a traditional Belgian-style wheat beer. It's unfiltered. The Belgians use a lot of unique ingredients in their white beers. This is traditionally spiced with coriander and orange peel. We use a secret spice in it as well. I always say if you get me drunk enough, I'll spill the beans and the secret spice. But I don't know if that's going to happen in the afternoon. So it's happened at some beer dinners and events. But secret spice in it, a lot of unmalted and malted wheat in it, and it's not filtered, as you can see. And or it's very gently filtered. What that does is it leaves some of the yeast and protein in suspension in the beer. And not only does that contribute to the kind of nice, elegant, cloudy look to the beer, but it contributes a lot to the flavor and mouthfeel of the beer. Over time, this will actually settle out, and the beer will be bright. And if you decant it from the bottle and just pour the bright beer, the beer tastes quite a bit different. So anyway, got a few pictures. This is a picture of the outside of the brewery. We started in a building next to this. I rented about 4,000 square feet of a warehouse, and we outgrew that after about 12 years and just built this facility. So basically, this is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time. This is how yeast metabolizes sugar, breaks down into carbon dioxide. I'm going to go through each of these chemical reactions. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not. I used to actually know a little bit of that, but so don't ask me anything too technical. So they threw this picture in. That's me, believe it or not. A lot of people say, did you ever drink, crappy beer or kind of bland beer in the old days? That's me with a Budweiser there. I think that was outside of a Grateful Dead concert like 20 years ago. So now that I have to go get bank loans, I cleaned up my act a little bit. But these are some early pictures of the brewery. The space I leased. I basically did all the, 90% of all the work in there, cut drainage trenches in the floor, did a lot of the plumbing, a lot of the electrical work, did a lot of the welding. That tank, which is kind of all banged up and dented, is our mash tun. It's actually still our mash tun. We've done quite a bit of work on it. You'll see a picture of it later. It's worked real well for us, but it's just an old dairy tank. It used to hold cream at a dairy somewhere, probably a 50-year-old dairy tank. And there's on the left our first fermenter. We just stood those up with chain falls and block and tackles. And there's probably a year and a half, 2 years into business. Our first employee, Ned White, he was with us for 5 years. He's a great guy. We still stay in very close touch. Actually, do you guys, I'll show you a couple more pictures, and then we'll talk about some of the beers. There's an early picture of us bottling. The big bottles, you guys notice some of the a lot of the beers we do are in these big bottles. These are imported from France. There's only a couple plants in the world that make this kind of traditional Belgian bottle. So this is how we used to bottle those beers. We just filled them 4 bottles at a time on a little hand filler. And then that's me, I think, corking there. So you had to put every single cork in, push it into the bottle. It was definitely very labor intensive. And then the guy on the right who's doing the hooder is Jason Perkins. He's now our brewmaster. So there's Jason, again, our brewmaster on the right. And there's me looking like I'm working for a picture. So I honestly don't get down. I was brewmaster for the first 12 years. I handed that torch over to Jason about 3 years ago. He's much more capable than I am. Does a great job. I just found I just didn't have time to spend enough time down actually making the beer on the production floor. So Jason's now in charge of that. I still spend quite a bit of time down there, but not a lot of time actually doing things. They try to keep me away. I screw things up when I get involved. And this is our brewery now. That tank on the left up on the platform is actually that same old dented tank with tons of, we've just retrofitted it and we haven't automated it at all. We've mechanized it. So it's got, instead of having to stir the grain with plastic shovels, we've got a machine that stirs it. And instead of hooking up hoses to each of the tanks and rolling a pump around to move the beer from tank to tank, a lot of it's hard pipe. So a lot of changes that kind of make life easier. But, and then as I talk here, definitely ask questions. Just raise your hand and ask a question. I think there's a mic up here, but I'm sure you can just ask. So, question? Yeah, it's a good question. Using aluminum cans? I've actually thought about it maybe, especially for going out on the boat. We're right on the water. By the way, I never even mentioned this. We're in Portland, Maine. It's right on the water. Right on the water. It's perfect for something like that. But right now, one of the main reasons we haven't done it, and I think a can is a great package, and there's a lot of craft breweries in cans now. We've just got so many balls in the air. We're growing really fast right now, 25, 30% a year, which, but probably doesn't sound like too much for the tech industry. But in manufacturing, it gets tough to grow that fast, to be adding all that equipment, and there's constant change and process change. And we're really having to even pull out of markets because we're having trouble keeping up with demand. We just have too many balls in the air to do a can. But down the line, we definitely might do that. I think it would be kind of cool. I think it'd be cool to do our white beer in a can at some point. So some of the beers we're trying, I talked about the white. Another beer, which I don't think I've got it up here, but I actually poured myself a glass, luckily, is the double. The Trappist monks traditionally brew a single and double and triple. And we've got the double and triple here today. These are the first 2 beers that we did in the big cork finish bottle. The Trappist monks traditionally brew the single for their own consumption. It's usually a low alcohol beer. Maybe brown, light brown or blonde in color. And that's what they brew for their own consumption. I always say, if I abstain from everything they abstain from, I'd probably drink heavily. But sometimes they don't drink, often they don't drink. But if they do, they drink the single. Their doubles and triples are their commercially available beers. Doubles are usually about 7, maybe 6 to 8% alcohol by volume. So it's starting to get, a little higher alcohol than most of the kind of standard domestic beers you're used to drinking. Not as high alcohol as some of the other beers we'll talk about in a little bit. But they're usually maybe 7 or so % alcohol, dark in color. And then their triples, actually, as you've probably already seen, it surprises people. Even though it's higher in alcohol, they're lighter in color. The color really doesn't have anything to do with alcohol. Guinness, which is a very dark beer, is actually pretty low in alcohol, just about 4%. And our triple, which is light in color, is pretty high in alcohol. That's about 9%. So triples are usually 8 or 9% by volume, light in color. And really the only thing that affects color is generally how much roasted malt you put in the beer. Yeah, question?
You mentioned Travis, and I guess Travis we're going to talk.
Yeah, they're pretty protective of their secrets. I've been to Belgium a number of times. I actually only visited a Trappist brewery on my last trip. I went to see Orval, which I love Orval. It's a great beer, and the monastery is like unbelievably cool. It's really cool. We showed up there in the morning at like 8 in the morning, met the guy who runs the business side of the brewery. He's not a monk. He's not one of the brothers there. But we showed up there at about 9 in the morning. There was like a dusting of frost and snow everywhere, and it's this beautiful old stone building. It's really impressive. But we actually did get a tour of the brewery there. Some of the Trappist breweries are very protective, and they really don't want a lot of people coming through the monastery or the brewery. Some of them are a little more open. Orval, I think they only open their doors a couple days a year to let people through the brewery. But it was pretty cool. And I went there with a bar owner in Boston, Massachusetts, David Sicolo from the Public House, which is, if any of you are ever up in Boston, it's a great spot to drink beer, great food. But we're going to try to go back now every year and go see another one of the Trappist breweries. We're going to see Chimay in about a month, which I'm really looking forward to. So, but yeah, I've been to a lot of breweries in Belgium, but only been to one of the Trappist breweries. And Orval's an interesting one too, because their beer doesn't really fall into one of the traditional singles, doubles, and triples. They only do one beer in one package. I guess it's its own thing. It's a little bit bitter, a little bit bready, which you'll taste some Brett character in one of our beers. So a little bit of a wild character. And they do the Petite Orval, which is basically a watered down version of Orval for the monks, which I tried, which is pretty cool. Yep. The white is actually the lowest alcohol beer we brew at 5%. The Belgian beers tend to be, there are definitely some lower alcohol Belgian beers, and the white is about 85% of our production, but a lot of the traditional Belgian style beers tend to be pretty high in alcohol. And in a lot of ways, they drink almost like kind of a hybrid between beer and wine. Belgium's kind of sandwiched between Germany and France, so their culture picks up a lot of influence from beer culture, of course, from Germany, but it also picks up a lot of influence from wine culture. I think the biggest part of the influence is in the yeast strains. We, in some ways, and if you talk to different brewers of Belgian-style beers, they'll tell you different things. Everyone has their own kind of opinions on them. But we almost look at it as making beer with wine yeast. And another one of those influences is the higher alcohol content. But you'll taste some of these beers, especially the Interlude, it almost tastes as much like a wine as it does a beer. The Interlude? Yeah, sure. So this is actually one of the things that is exciting us more than anything about Belgian-style beers. And one of the reasons we got into them is the Belgian beer culture is very experimental by nature, and they use, most brewing cultures will use traditional ale or lager yeasts. The Belgian brewers use just a huge variety of ale and lager yeast, but they also use a lot of bacteria to ferment with and a lot of wild yeasts. And you just can't get these flavors anywhere else. You can put additives in beer that give you maybe some similar characters, but the character these yeasts give you when they re-ferment are real unique. This particular beer, we really kind of stumbled into it. It was almost basically a mistake or a problem batch of beer. We were doing a beer which was very loosely based on a saison, which is a traditional style of Belgian beer. And we brewed this beer, and saison yeast is notorious for, and at some point I'll talk basically about the basics of making beer. I kind of have skipped over that. But, excuse me. The saison yeast, which is the yeast used in a saison, is notorious for petering out during fermentation, about halfway through the fermentation. So the yeast will be eating the sugars, giving off carbon dioxide and alcohol, and it'll really slow down or peter out. very commonly halfway through fermentation, and that's exactly what happened to this. The yeast basically fermented out the beer halfway. It's probably about 4% by volume alcohol, and then it just stopped. And we were concerned because we had a 500-gallon batch of beer, which at the time was pretty big for us, that just basically wasn't fermenting, and we couldn't get it going. We did everything that we knew to kind of start the fermentation again. We couldn't, so we just kind of forgot about it, left it in the tank. It was a dairy tank that we didn't need for a couple months, so we just figured we'd leave it there. Well, I came into work probably 2 weeks after that, or maybe even a little bit longer, 3 weeks, and it was fermenting again. They're enclosed tanks, and we have a hose that comes out of the tank. We put in a bucket of water with a little bit of chlorine, and you can see it bubbling when it's fermenting. It hadn't been bubbling for 2 or 3 weeks, and I walked by, and I was like, oh, well, cool, it's starting to ferment again. So we went and tasted the beer, and we were like, there's definitely something in this beer that we did not add. There's the flavor profile was totally being transformed. So we have a pretty extensive lab program for a brewery our size. Now it's even much more extensive than it was back then. And sure enough, we ran through the lab. There was a wild yeast that was fermenting this beer. And it had a lot in common, and we think it is, with Brettanomyces, which is a traditional yeast used in it's a wild yeast used in a lot of traditional Belgian beers. And it just gives you these funky, in each different strain of yeast is different, but some of them give you kind of a barnyard character. Some people say horsehair or horse blanket. And you can definitely get some of that in this beer. It ferments it out very dry, almost like a wine. And after this beer was done, we fell in love with the flavors. It took about 3 months or 4 months to finish fermentation, which is very long. Usually fermentations last a week to 2 weeks. And we just fell in love with this flavor. It didn't have some of the more coarse character you get in some Bretts, which can be real, have a lot of that kind of horsehair, barnyard character. But it had just some refined, subtle touches of that. And then a lot of fruity characters, a lot of vinous wine characters. And I've got a buddy that's a winemaker at Plump Jack Winery in Napa. And I called up my buddy Tony and said, geez, could we get some barrels you use for red wine? We think this beer would be a real good fit for it. So he sent us 8. We bought 8 of these great French oak wine barrels, which really they couldn't use anymore because most of the oak character was out of them. And we aged this beer, aged half of it in the French oak for 8 months, and then left half of it in the stainless steel, and then blended the two together. And this is the result. And it's a real. When we released it 3 years ago, this was a really funky beer. Excuse me. Now it's almost, with some of these funky Belgian-style and experimental beers that are out there, it's not even considered that funky. But it is real unique. It almost drinks as much like a wine, like a beer. There are. Avery Brewing, I think it's their 15th anniversary. They used a Brett yeast. Vinny out at Russian River Brewing uses a lot of wild yeast and bacteria, a lot of barrel aging. He's doing some phenomenal beers. Sam at Dogfish, Tommy Arthur in Southern California in the San Diego area. And in a number of other brewers, Ron Jeffries at Jolly Pumpkin does a lot. He's in Michigan with wild yeast and bacteria. And it's amazing, kind of to circle back to the first thing I mentioned with this beer, this is something that excites us more than anything else in brewing, because it's outside of Belgium, no one really had been using these bacteria and wild yeast to make beer for years. And in fact, they're really considered a defect in beers. But in Belgian brewing, they're traditional, and there are a lot of U.S. brewers that are starting to use them to create these flavors that no one's had before.
Did you go back and isolate the particular?
We did. Yeah, this wild yeast, we were so worried we'd lose it that we sent it to 2 separate yeast labs, and now they bank the yeast for us. And whenever we make this beer, we actually have to ask them both to grow it. It's kind of a finicky yeast. And so very often one of them can't grow the yeast for us to add to the batch. So we have to get it from both yeast producers just to make sure it comes in. So they bank this yeast for us and then our proprietary yeast, which we use for the white beer.
Are there also lactic acid bacteria?
There are no lactic bacteria in any of the beers we're trying today. The yeast that's in this, the Brettanomyces, what we think is a Brettanomyces, is a wild yeast. So the bacteria is Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, a number of other bacteria that the brewers use. We're starting to experiment with, and we've got a number of beers, and we've sold some beers on a very small scale that are just available at the brewery, the Vagabond and Gargamel, that use some of those microbes. But we haven't sold any on a commercial scale. And one interesting way to add some of these wild yeast and bacteria is just by adding fruit to the beer. So we've done a lot of beers with sour cherries, raspberries, grapes, blueberries, and those fruits naturally have these same microorganisms. They have wild yeast and bacteria all over them. So when you add those to a batch of beer, you can get some of these fermentations. And the lactobacillus, the lactic acid bacteria, gives the beer a real tart character. This gets a little bit of tartness from the Brett, but it isn't real tart.
Now, does this beer age over time? Does it age in the bottle? And how long do you recommend aging the Interlude?
Yeah, this beer definitely does evolve over time. The whole aging beer thing, we kind of are torn with. Definitely our white beer, fresher is better. It's a lower alcohol beer. Don't let me forget to talk about bottle conditioning a little bit, which does extend the shelf life of a beer and make it pretty appropriate to age. But I really think as you get into bottle conditioned beers, higher alcohol beers, their shelf life goes way beyond 6 months. And our triple, we've got bottles of the triple that are 7, 8 years old that are still drinking great, that we've stored at cool temperatures, cellar temperatures, in the dark, and they're drinking great. They evolve quite a bit. They pick up a big honey character, passion fruit character. The Interlude does the same thing. That we haven't been brewing this beer for too long, only a few years. We've got some of the original bottles, and they're drinking great. And actually, I think beer made with traditional, and this is just kind of our opinion and our take on it, beer made with traditional ale and lager yeast, the higher alcohol bottle conditioned beers, they have a good shelf life, like the triple, and they can age fairly well. Once you start using some of the wild yeast and bacteria, I think the beers start to hold up a lot better. They don't tend to get oxidized, and they don't get a tired taste. When beer oxidizes, it gets kind of a cardboardy, papery character. And for some reason, these beers don't tend to oxidize very much. So they hold up pretty well. So to answer your question, this beer, it drinks great right when it comes out of the brewery. I think it drinks fine after a year. 3 to 5 years, it's probably going to be drinking okay, but it's really not intended to be aged beyond that like you would like a cab wine. Yep. Yep. We'll open one of those. So, this is another beer, and it's funny. A lot of the beers that we've done, we really just kind of stumble across. This beer is called the Curio. It's our triple. It's aged in Jim Beam bourbon barrels for only about 2 months. The bourbon barrels totally transform this beer. So it goes in tasting like the triple, which we talked about and you guys have tried. The reason we came up with this beer, Susan's our rep in this area. She's sick of hearing this story, but you have to listen to it again. So, this is a true story. We had as I mentioned, these bottles come from Europe. It's a very traditional bottle in Belgium. For the Trappist breweries and a lot of the other beers in Belgium. It's a heavy glass bottle which can withstand high carbonation levels, which these beers have. And we need to get these bottles from Europe, and there was a shipment that was delayed. and we needed to bottle a batch of triple. It was in a tank. It was tying up a tank. We had to brew into the tank 2 or 3 days later. So we needed to bottle this beer. We weren't kegging the triple at the time, but we were going to be basically a couple pallets of bottles short, which would have left about 120 gallons of beer in the tank. So we also, about 2 weeks prior, had gotten 2 Jim Beam bourbon barrels from Jim Beam, which we were going to experiment with a couple different kind of beers. We really thought that a darker beer would be better suited for a bourbon barrel. I think it's one of those almost misconceptions. A lot of people think that a darker beer is higher alcohol. For some reason, we thought that a darker beer would be the only thing that would work in a bourbon barrel. But we had this triple. We don't like to waste beer. So we, instead of dumping the beer that didn't have a home in bottles, we filled these 2 bourbon barrels, bunged the barrels up very tightly I don't know why we sealed these barrels so tightly, with wooden bungs, which will hold the pressure in the barrel really well. And basically put them in our warm room where we re-ferment our beers. And that was on a Wednesday. I came in on a Saturday, and it looked like the barrels were about to explode, basically. They were almost like shaking with pressure. There was beer squirting out between the staves of the barrels. And the heads of the barrels were literally bulging. And I panicked because if one of those explodes, it would be, an unimaginable mess probably. So I ran and got a hammer and a screwdriver, and I just tried to tap one of the bungs, and I was going to gently bleed some pressure out. And I basically just touched the bung, and it exploded, went up and hit the ceiling. I got covered with beer. I couldn't see anything. So I took off my glasses, and there was foam kind of geysering out. It was calming down a little, but geysering out of the bung and cascading down the side of the barrel. So I got down on my knees. It was the first thing I could think of doing, and just started sucking the foam off the side of the barrel. So, and I was sucking the foam, and then I paused and I was like, wow, this stuff's really good. And it had totally transformed. I forget which one. Did I pour one yet? No. Oh, there it is. So it had just totally transformed the beer because it had been triple that we put in the keg or the cask just a couple days before, and it had these huge coconut flavors, huge vanilla flavors, some herbal characters. And I ran to the phone and called Jason, who's now our brewmaster, and I was like, man, we got to make this stuff. So that next Monday, we called Jim Beam and ordered 10 bourbon barrels. So we got a great relationship with Jim Beam. They're really good people. I was just actually talking to them this week about getting barrels from them next year. We're probably the smallest customer they have for buying. It's a pretty big business for them to use bourbon barrels. If it says bourbon on the bottle, they can only use the barrel one time, so they have all these barrels to sell. A lot of them go to single malt Scotch distilleries. Some of them go to make tequilas and rums probably and other whiskeys. But they're kind enough to only, we only buy a couple hundred a year from them. But they take good care of us.
How much are the barrels?
I don't know the exact number. It's over $100 to get them to us, though. By the time it's delivered, it's well over $100. So it's a pretty big market, the used barrel business. But they're great people at Jim Beam, and I love Jim Beam. I love Jim Beam, just the white label Jim Beam. So, yeah.
I wonder if you can do, just a quick description of the various beers you brought. I know there have been a lot of questions. Once over all.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go through those. And how am I doing on time, too? What do we got? We're good? Okay, all right. Until the beer's gone. That's when the thing ends, right? Basically, first of all of our bottled beers go through a process called bottle conditioning. And it's a process that's traditional in the traditional breweries in Belgium. Not all Belgian breweries do it. And very few breweries in the U.S. do it. And basically with that process, the beer gets bottled with little or no carbonation. And just prior to bottling it, just like the champagne makers do, we'll add a fresh dose of yeast and sugar to the beer, mix it up, and then bottle it. And then the beer goes into our warm room or our cellar, and there's a secondary fermentation in the bottle. The yeast will eat the sugar, give off carbon dioxide and alcohol. And that process can take a week to a few months, depending on the beer, but it naturally carbonates the beer. So that's why these beers all have a yeast sediment in the bottom of them. But that process gives you a huge amount of additional layers of flavor in aromas and complexity, and it also increases the shelf life of the beer by quite a bit. So the basic rundown, the white, I mentioned, traditional Belgian-style wheat beer, 5% unfiltered and spiced. The double and triple are the Trappist-style beers we brew, which I described those. The next would be the Curio, which is our triple aged in the Jim Beam bourbon barrels. And then a couple beers we haven't tried yet. I think the only other two are the Odyssey and the Black. The Odyssey is an interesting one. We brewed that, and we have a real open culture at the brewery. If anyone has an idea on a beer, we're open to listening to it. It's not just me that, in fact, I didn't come up with most of these beers. It's usually someone at the brewery that has a cool idea for a cool beer, and we'll all kind of look at each other and be like, yeah, let's try it. Let's try brewing it. So, anyone, even if they work in the office, they can come up with an idea for a beer. And nowadays, we used to just brew it and try it. Nowadays, we'll be a little more methodical and do it on a small scale. But a guy named Scott Abel came up with this recipe, and it's a dark wheat beer, and it's very unlike most wheat beers that you usually think of as traditional wheat beers. A lot of roasted malts. When we fermented it out the first time, it really didn't have a whole lot of character. It was real kind of thin and dry. But we liked where the beer was going, so we decided to take a small portion of it and age it in new American oak barrels, kind of give it a real vanilla Mocha character. So we took about 25-30% of the beer, got some new American oak barrels, the same ones they'd use if you were aging a wine in an American oak barrel, and aged the beer for 10 months in the oak, aged the remainder of the beer for 10 months in stainless steel, and then blended the two together. And it just between the time in that oak, it totally transforms the beer. You can get a big vanilla character in this beer. This particular batch has got almost a little bit of a smoky character to it, and Mocha. That's all from the medium and light toast oak barrels. Something else I was going to mention about this beer, but I forgot. So it's interesting with the barrels. A lot of people say, why do you age in barrels? Is that just kind of marketing or gimmicky? Does it really do anything to the beer? And the answer is it absolutely transforms the beer. It becomes a totally different beer. If you were to take this same base beer, age it in bourbon, age the same beer in a bourbon barrel, a wine barrel that's been used for wine, a new American oak barrel, a new French oak barrel, you get totally different beers out of those barrels after a few months. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it picks up tons of flavors of vanillins from the wood, tannins from the wood, a number of flavors. And actually, and we use this with the Interlude. A lot of these microbes, bacteria and wild yeast, can actually live in the wood. The wood can support them. So you can empty a barrel, and those microbes will stay in it, and then add another batch of beer, age it for 6 months to a year, and those microbes will start working away at that beer, transforming it, giving you some nice tart characters, funky characters. So, well, the normal, triple, and the Curio. Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, you can put the triple and the Curio next to each other, and they're totally different beers. It really transforms the beers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. The Odyssey. Oh, are you guys out of this one? If you want, pass it around. No problem. Yeah, pass it around. Yeah. It's a pretty cool beer. You get in, there's just all kinds of with the Curio. It was funny. We had been making it for 6 or so months, and I brought it to, actually it was the Ommegang. Belgium comes to Cooperstown Brewfest, which if any of you like Brewfest, that's a phenomenal Brewfest. It's great. You can camp out. They have really cool beers. It's a really great setting. The Allagash Brewery is beautiful. And I was at that, and this guy, Lou Bryson, who's a good friend of mine in Philly, who's a beer writer, he takes a sip of the Curio, and he's like, well, there's dill in this. And I'm like, what, dill? And so I tasted some. I was like, well, I do get a dill character from this. I was like, I wonder if like someone had pickles in this keg before or something. It tasted like dill pickly. And I kind of panicked. I was like, what's the deal with these kegs? And then I went back to the brewery. We tried some different batches of Curio. They all have this dill character. And a few months later, I was looking at a flavor wheel that I'd gotten from a barrel manufacturer that showed all these different flavors you get from oak. And one of them is like an herbaceous dill character. So that's something you get out of the oak for this particular beer. And interestingly enough, I mentioned if you age the same beer in different oak barrels, you get a different beer out of each of these barrels. If you age different beers in the same type of oak barrel, so if you have 5 different bourbon barrels, put 5 different beers in it, the beers take different flavors out of the oak, or at least the flavors that come out of the oak express themselves differently in each of these different kinds of beers. So it's really interesting. The Curio, you get that dill from the oak. We do another beer called the Musette that's aged in the bourbon barrels. You don't get that dill. You get a lot of Mocha character from the oak. So it's pretty interesting. Yep.
I have 2 questions. One, what made you decide to become a brewer? Why did you decide on Belgian style beers?
Good question. I totally stumbled into the beer business, literally. I mean, you could see the picture of me. That was like beer for me was the cheaper, the better. When I was I went to school in Vermont, lived in Colorado for a couple of years. I was basically drinking $3.99 12 packs of Hams and $3.99 12 packs of Pilsner Club. And I was very happy. And I moved back to Vermont where I'd gone to school, and I was going to go to grad school for geology. And actually my parents were excited because they were like, finally after, 4 years of college, you've got some direction. And I wanted to be a geology teacher. So they were all excited they had some direction. And, the day I got back to Middlebury, Vermont, where I'd gone to school, I called a buddy of mine. I found a place to live, got on the phone, called a buddy of mine. I said, hey, dude, I just need a job. I'll do anything. I want a job. Do you know of anything in town? And he goes, you want to wash kegs at a brewery that I work at? I didn't even know that was a job. And I saw the light bulb went off in my head. I was like, is there free beer involved with this job? And he said, yeah, there's free beer. You get, a half gallon of beer every day. So I said, I'll take the job. So I showed up that day, and I had done a lot of jobs during college and high school, a lot of construction jobs in the summer. And I'd done a lot of that work in Colorado. And I love working with my hands. I love construction. I'd done a lot of plumbing and some welding. And I walked and I love just building things and working with my hands. I walked in the brewery. I was like, well, wow, this has got like everything, like electrical, plumbing, and there's pipes everywhere and pumps and motors. And I worked there for 2 days, and I saw that. I saw like the creative end of brewing. I tasted these beers, which I'd really never tasted before. I was like, wow, I didn't know that places like made these beers. And I just fell in love with it in 2 days. And I remember I called my parents, and my mom and dad were on the phone, and I was like, I've got news for you guys. And they were excited that I was getting a grad school application. And I said, I've decided I'm not going to grad school. I'm going to be a brewer for a living. And it was like silent on the other end of the line. And then after seemed like an eternity, my mom goes, Rob, one of these days you're going to have to stop living in a fantasy land. But they, after a while they got behind it and they realized it was a legitimate business. So, but I literally stumbled into it. I have no idea what I'd be doing now, probably teaching geology, which I would have been happy with, but I sure wouldn't have been able to drink in the middle of the day if I was teaching geology. So. Why the Belgian beers? One of the things that's always intrigued me, when I brewed at Otter Creek. That's where I spent the first year, which is a great brewery. The owner there was super supportive of me going off and starting a brewery, which is cool. But every once in a while, during say a month's period, people would bring in beers that they'd get at a liquor store, maybe, because at that time there was just all these beers coming out in the market, imports coming in, and people would bring these beers in, put them in the fridge, and we'd accumulate maybe 10 or 15 beers, and then after work, we'd just try the different beers. Everyone would try a little bit of each of these beers. And whenever anyone brought these Belgian-style beers in, I was like, wow, what is going on with this? I mean, they were just all over the map. There's sour beers and fruit beers and these Brett beers and the Trappist beers, Saisons, wheat beers. It's just all over the map. And I was just intrigued by, it's almost like there's an unlimited palette you can draw from with ingredients and with yeast and kind of make whatever you want. So I liked the fact that it was just so experimental by nature and so much different. And also at the time, there were only a couple breweries in the country doing Belgian-style beers exclusively. And funny enough, there still are only a couple breweries in the country that do exclusively Belgian-style beers. So. It's funny, a lot of our, knock on wood, like larger scaled beers, we've been pretty blessed with, I think. One of the reasons I think we haven't made too many big mistakes with those beers, and there's a couple I'll mention, but we've really been methodical about the way we've grown. We've been in business 15 years. A lot of breweries will start out with 6 or 7 different beers, and bottling and kegging in multiple territories. We just started, what's that, 4 o'clock? Oh, how much time do we have? 5 minutes? Okay. We really tried to take the approach, walk before we run. We just did one beer, draft only, just in the Portland market, and spent a year doing that, and then added another beer. So as we've gotten more daring with our beers, we've only done it when we've had a lot of experience under our belt. But there are definitely some beers. Like the first time we did the Grand Cru, we used anise in that beer. And for our white beer, back then in a batch, which was about 500 gallons, 15-barrel batch, we put 16 ounces of coriander in it. So we're like, 16 ounces of coriander, 16 ounces of anise. So we dumped it in. It was like drinking liquid licorice. And just to give you an idea how much it was, we worked that recipe all the way down to a tablespoon of anise to give it a little bit of that licorice taste. But that particular batch of beer, we should have just dumped it, but we were cutting like 1 barrel of this one batch into every single larger batch that year for like months and months. So we've had some issues like that for sure. Yep.
Pass around the interlude you have, and also
Oh, sure.
talk about the black beer?
Actually, I'm going to hold on to these because I don't know if this is enough for me to get through the rest of the thing. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, you can definitely, and I haven't even talked about the black. So here, I'll open the black, pass that around, and then I think we got to finish up. So this I got to show you guys the slides of the brewery too. Okay, we're going to bang through these. Hops, I have this in there. People asked about the hop crisis, whether that was real. That pallet of hops a year and a half ago would have cost us about $4,000 or $5,000. Last year, we had to buy that on the spot market. It cost about $60,000. So, yes, there was a hop crisis. Here's some pictures of the brewery. You sure? Okay. Okay, cool. The hops are grown in the Pacific Northwest and also in Czechoslovakia for the bulk of our hops. So. It was a market worldwide crisis. It was all kinds of things. It was like a perfect storm. For years, hop prices have been depressed. Farmers weren't making money on it. They were pulling their crops. And it takes a couple years for a hop crop to really establish itself. So they were pulling it out, and basically supply was starting to go down, and it got to the point where supply dipped right down to where demand was. And at the same time that happened, there was a big hop fire, or warehouse fire. A bunch of hops burned in a warehouse, a couple percent of the supply. There was a spider mite infestation in the Pacific Northwest, and there was hailstorms in Germany that destroyed crops. So all this stuff happened at once, and there was a panic. And hops is one of those things, if there's a little bit of extra hops in the market, the price goes way down because, people don't really do anything with hops except make beer. But if they're hops, if you're 2% short on a hop supply, brewers will pay anything just to get, to not run out of beer or not run out of the ability to make beer. Some other pictures of the brewery. This is the new brewery. That's our bottling line with some tanks in the background. This is Tom rinsing off some bourbon barrels after filling them to make the curio. Off the record, yeah. Actually, we are required to make sure we dump the barrels so there's no alcohol left in the barrels, and we usually do get a little bit of bourbon out of some of those barrels. So it comes out looking like this from the charcoal, and you pour it through a coffee filter. It comes out crystal clear out the other side of the coffee filter, and it is potent. It's uncut. So there's some bourbon barrels there. A 2,500-gallon foeder, French oak foeder in the background, which we've been aging beer in that for a year with some of these wild yeasts that are in the Interlude. Should I pass this curio around too? Do you guys? Yeah, we might as well drink these beers, right? There's Jason, I think, actually sampling some bourbon after it's been filtered. Do you guys want this one too? Or want to pass that around? So here's Jason with a couple. This is a real open business. We have brewers from all over the country coming in the brewery. You guys saw Sam Calagione speak here. I'm very good friends with Sam. Everyone's real friendly in this business. Any brewer can always come in our brewery. There's no secrets there. These are some brewers from Belgium that we did a collaboration brew with. And this is actually that same day. Jason is pouring a collaboration beer I did with Tommy, Vinny, Adam, and Sam. Again, collaboration. We'll kind of cruise through these.
So I have a question for you.
Yep.
So when Sam was here, he talked about a competition he had with friendly rivalry he had with Sam Adams.
Okay.
They were both trying to produce the most alcohol.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Have you been tempted to join in on this rate?
We don't, with the higher alcohol beers, we really haven't gotten into doing our highest alcohol beer is the Curio at 11%. We really haven't gotten into those, but those beers are really cool. I mean, Sam's got some really cool higher alcohol beers like the 120-minute IPA and what's the Worldwide Stout, yeah. They're just that higher alcohol. It's not just to have higher alcohol. That really gives you some cool flavors. Sam Adams does the Utopias, which I love. You just get, it almost drinks like a liqueur as much as a beer or like a port. But we haven't really done anything over 11%. And I don't think we will. We're more interested in messing around with some of the wild yeast and bacterias. But those higher alcohol beers are pretty cool. That's a very good lead-in question for this. I went to Belgium with that same group of guys, Sam, Adam, Tommy, Vinny. Sam, Adam, Tommy, Vinny, and me. I think that was it. And we really focused on visiting lambic breweries. When I was over there, I got all excited about lambic beers. And then towards the end of the trip, I was like, you know what? These are really, let's leave these to the Belgians. These beers, basically what you do with these beers is you brew a batch of beer, and instead of cooling it after the brewing process, after the boil, in a sterile heat exchanger, and adding a single cell yeast culture and fermenting the beer out with this controlled yeast culture, you cool the beer in a big open vessel exposed to the outside air. The outside air both cools the beer, and it also adds natural yeast and bacteria to the beer. And basically, all brewers really in the world have always been told that you can only really make these traditional lambic beers in the Seine Valley region and in the Brussels area, in Belgium. So I just woke up one morning about a year after going on that trip, and I was like, let's just try making these beers. Why not? So it'll probably be a huge waste of money, but you can see this is a cool ship that we built on this slide here. This holds about 400 gallons of beer. The boiled wort goes into this vessel. cools overnight, gets inoculated with natural yeast and bacteria from Portland. We had no idea whether this would work. We didn't do any kind of experimentation. We just did it. It was kind of stupid, but we were curious to see if it would work. And it actually did. It did work. The beer, you can see this is the wort being pumped into this room. The louvered windows let the air in. I don't know if we'll ever sell this beer. We were more just curious to see if it would work.
Are there major providers of Lifting in the U.S.?
No breweries outside of Belgium really do it. Some breweries in the U.S. have done some spontaneously fermented beers, but none that I know of have built like a commercial cool ship. So hopefully this. 2 years. We brewed this batch just about 2 years ago. This is the next morning. It's the smallest of the batches we did. This batch actually, there was the Yves Spinel who does a festival every 2 years in Belgium. That's one of the big lambic and sour beer fests. Was over at the brewery about 2 or 3 months ago and tasted this first batch and the second batch. And he wants it at Brewfest he's holding over there in December for traditional lambics. And a traditional unblended lambic is 2 years old. It's not a combination of different barrels. It comes from one barrel. It's basically uncarbonated, spontaneously fermented beer. And we're bottling that beer, I think, Monday, this batch, 2 years old after fermenting spontaneously in French oak. And it came out pretty well. So we'll see what the reaction is. We were just curious to see if it would work. That's that batch of beer fermenting in the barrel, just from natural yeast and bacteria from Portland. It tastes like, have you ever had some of the sour beers? It tastes like a lambic beer. It's a little different. It's definitely a little different. But we've also taken a number of those barrels and added fruit to them. Some sour cherries, some raspberries we've added to barrels, and it's tasting pretty good. We're actually kind of surprised. So, all right, I'll quickly mention this last beer is the Allagash Black. This is basically, it's again another recipe. It's loosely based on a stout, but it's fermented with a Belgian yeast strain. So we call it like a Belgian stout for lack of a better description. Not really a stout, but it's just the Allagash Black. So, yeah. Definitely. And actually, Susan, who reps us in the market, can tell you the best place to get it or where to get it.
Probably the best places to find some of these like the Interlude and some other beers he does like the Victoria and the Victor. They are a little bit harder to find just because they're such a small batch production. But in general, Whole Foods, specifically the one down on the Bowery in Houston, that's a great beer store. On Christie Street between Houston and Delancey, there's a store called New Beer, N-E-W. I believe it's 167 Christie Street. They have a really good Allagash selection of almost all the big bottles that are available in the market. In Brooklyn on 4th Street, there's a place called American Beer, and there's another place in Park Slope called Beer Craft. And of those places, you can usually be able to find it. If you can't, there's a website called greatbrewers.com. And you can go on there, put in your zip code, and click on Allagash, click on the specific beer you're looking for, you put in your zip code, and they'll give it to you within a couple 100-mile radius where you can find beers contract.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and beer menus, of course. That's another really good website.
That's the brewery crew there. We're an interesting crew. All
Nice.
of us.
Hi, Google. I love it. Sadly, guys, we have to stop. I could listen to this stuff for hours. But we do have another event in here at 4:30. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Rob Tod.
Thank you guys very much.